October 25, 1944. Philippine Sea, east of Samar Island. The binoculars quivered slightly in Enan William Brooks's hands as he looked down from his Grumman TBF Avenger at 1,500 feet above the gray waters, speaking into his radio words that would chill every man in Task Unit April 3, 77. "Those are not our ships." From his vantage point on a routine anti-submarine patrol launched from escort carrier USS St. Lo, he had just observed something that contradicted every assumption about the Japanese fleet's expected location. Pagoda-like masts emerging from the horizon in the dim light of early morning. The unmistakable silhouette of the largest battleship ever constructed, cutting through wisps of mist, followed by an entire armada of heavy cruisers and battleships steaming at full speed directly toward 6 small escort carriers with no means to stop them. Rear Admiral Clifton A. F. Sprague, commanding officer of Task Unit April 3, 77, had been assured that the powerful Third Fleet under Admiral William F. Halsey protected his northern flank. The San Bernardino Strait, between Luzon and Samar, was supposedly blocked by American battleships. Yet here, materializing from the early morning haze at 0637, came the full might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force, for battleships including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers against 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The calculations of naval warfare were being rewritten not in manuals, but in decisions that would have to be made in the next 60 seconds. The impossible had occurred, and the response would trigger one of the most audacious actions in naval history, when tiny destroyers and destroyer escorts charged battleships in a near-suicidal run that should never have succeeded. The path to this moment began months earlier as American forces advanced relentlessly across the Pacific. By October 1944, the liberation of the Philippines had become strategically inevitable. American forces landed on Leyte Island on October 20, threatening to sever Japan's access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia. Without those resources flowing northward, the Japanese Empire's war machine would collapse within months. The Imperial Japanese Navy recognized this existential threat. They devised Operation Shogo 1, Victory Operation 1, a complex 3-pronged plan designed to annihilate the American invasion fleet anchored in Leyte Gulf. The plan was brilliant in design, requiring precise coordination between 3 separate naval forces converging from different directions. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead the northern force southward from Japan. His force consisted of 4 aircraft carriers, though these flat tops were mere shadows of their former strength. The carriers Zuikaku, Zuo, Chitos, and Chiyoda carried barely 100 aircraft in total, with pilots so inexperienced that many could barely land on carriers. This force existed solely as bait to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. Ozawa understood his mission was sacrificial. His carriers would draw Halsey northward while the real strike came from elsewhere. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would bring the southern force north through Surigao Strait. His battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers would assault the invasion fleet from below. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would command the center force, the most powerful element, steaming through San Bernardino Strait to strike directly at the vulnerable transport ships in Leyte Gulf. The center force represented the elite of what remained of Japanese naval power after 3 years of attrition warfare. The super battleship Yamato displaced 72,800 tons and carried 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. Each gun could fire a 3,220-pound armor-piercing shell over 26 miles with devastating precision. Her sister ship Musashi sailed alongside her, an identical floating fortress that had never sustained damage in combat. Battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna added their 14 and 16-inch guns to the formation. 10 heavy cruisers provided overwhelming mid-range firepower. Takao, Maya, Chokai, Mayoko, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, Tone, and Chikuma, each mounting 8 or 10 8-inch guns capable of destroying any American ship smaller than a battleship. Light cruisers Noshiro and Yahagi screened the formation with their rapid-fire 6-inch batteries. 11 destroyers completed the force. On paper, Operation Shogo 1 appeared flawless, but American submarines had already begun unraveling it before the plan fully deployed. On October 23, submarines USS Darter and USS Dace patrolled Palawan Passage west of the Philippines when sonar operators detected Kurita's force moving toward Leyte. Commander David McClintock on Darter and Commander Bladen Clagett on Dace coordinated a textbook attack. At dawn on October 23, they struck. Darter's torpedoes slammed into heavy cruiser Atego, Kurita's flagship. Massive explosions tore the cruiser apart. Atego sank in 18 minutes, taking 360 men with her. Vice Admiral Kurita was forced to abandon his flagship and swim for his life in shark-infested waters before being rescued by destroyer Kishinami. The psychological impact of nearly drowning while his command erupted around him would haunt Kurita's decision-making 48 hours later off Samar. Darter's second torpedo salvo hit heavy cruiser Takao, blowing off her stern and flooding her engineering spaces. Though Takao survived, she was crippled and forced to limp back to Brunei, escorted by 2 destroyers, removing 3 ships from Kurita's force. Dace torpedoed heavy cruiser Maya, which exploded spectacularly and sank within minutes. In the span of 1 hour, American submarines had sunk 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, and nearly killed the Japanese commander. Kurita transferred his flag to Yamato and pressed eastward despite the losses. The plan required his arrival at Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25. There was no time to reorganize or reconsider. The following day, October 24, brought disaster. American carrier aircraft from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet located Kurita's force transiting the Sibuyan Sea in central Philippines. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the afternoon. The super battleship Musashi became the focal point of the American assault. Over 4 hours, Musashi absorbed punishment that would have sunk any other warship afloat. American pilots reported hitting her with 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb strikes, though Japanese sources recorded 11 torpedoes and 10 bombs. The exact tally remains debated, but the result was indisputable. In 1935, on October 24, Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. Her sister ship Yamato would arrive at Samar the following morning without her. Kurita's force had suffered such punishment in the Sibuyan Sea that he temporarily reversed course westward around 1,500 hours, appearing to retreat. American pilots reported the center force as heavily damaged and withdrawing from the battle. Admiral Halsey, reading these reports aboard his flagship USS New Jersey, made the fateful decision that would leave Leyte Gulf's northern flank exposed. That evening, Halsey received reports of Ozawa's carrier force approaching from the north. The bait dangled before him proved irresistible. Carriers represented the decisive instrument of Pacific naval warfare, the tools that had won Coral Sea and Midway and devastated Japanese bases from Rabaul to Truk. A chance to destroy the remnants of Japan's carrier force could not be ignored. Halsey took his entire Third Fleet, including all 6 of his fast battleships and 8 fleet carriers with escorts, and raced north at maximum speed to engage Ozawa's force. He left no ships guarding San Bernardino Strait. More critically, he failed to clearly communicate this decision to Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid, commander of the 7th Fleet responsible for protecting the Leyte invasion. Halsey had sent a preparatory dispatch about forming Task Force 34, a powerful battleship group under Admiral Willis Lee to guard the strait. But this was merely a contingency, not an executed order. Through a series of miscommunications and assumptions, Kincaid believed Task Force 34 had been detached and was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor read the same dispatches and made the same assumption. No such force existed. The San Bernardino Strait lay wide open and completely unprotected. Kurita, having reorganized his battered force after Musashi's loss, reversed course again after nightfall and steamed eastward. At 00035 on October 25, his force passed through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Not a single American ship or aircraft observed the passage. The center force had been reduced but remained formidable. 4 battleships led by Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, Shokai, Jakuma, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, and Toni, light cruisers Noshiro and Yahagi, and 11 destroyers now headed south along the eastern coast of Samar Island toward the completely undefended American landing beaches. Between Kurita's overwhelming firepower and General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 vulnerable troops ashore stood only 3 small task units of escort carriers. These escort carriers, designated by radio call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, were never designed for surface combat. Built on merchant ship hulls at Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, they were slow, lightly armed, and unarmored. Their purpose was providing close air support for troops ashore and conducting anti-submarine patrols. The carriers mounted a single 5-inch gun for self-defense and several dozen 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons. Their aircraft carried bombs and rockets meant for Japanese bunkers and trucks, not armor-piercing weapons for naval combat. The carriers themselves had maximum speeds of 18 knots, barely faster than the merchant ships from which they were converted. Japanese cruisers could sustain 30 knots, meaning they would close range inexorably regardless of American maneuvering. Taffy 3, the northernmost unit positioned closest to San Bernardino Strait, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton A. Sprague. The 48-year-old career officer was known as Ziggy to distinguish him from Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague, no relation, commanding Taffy 190 miles to the south. Ziggy Sprague's force consisted of 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers displacing 7,800 tons each, about 50,000 tons combined. USS Fansa Bay, hull number CVE-70, served as flagship. USS St. CVE-63, USS White Plains CVE-66, USS Kinnan Bay CVE-68, USS Kitcon Bay CVE-71, and USS Gambia Bay CVE-73 completed the carrier contingent. Each carrier embarked approximately 28 aircraft divided between FM-2 Wildcat fighters, improved versions of the obsolescent F-4F Wildcat and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Total aircraft strength for Taffy-3 numbered approximately 165 planes, equivalent to 2 fleet carriers, but with pilots trained primarily for ground support missions rather than naval combat. Screening these carriers were 7 small warships collectively designated the Small Boys, a term of endearment that reflected both their size and their crew's affection for ships designed for unglamorous escort duty. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers provided the heavier punch: USS Johnston DD-557, USS Hull DD-533, and USS Herman DD-532. Each displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded and carried 5 single 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets. These weapons fired 54-pound shells to ranges of 18,000 yards. Under ideal conditions, though effective range against moving targets was considerably less. Their main anti-ship weapons were 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts carrying Mark 15 torpedoes with 825 pounds warheads and ranges of 10,000 yards at 46 knots. 4 John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts completed the screen: USS Samuel B. Roberts DE-413, USS Dennis D-45, USS John C. Butler DE-339, and USS Raymond DE-341 displaced only 1,350 tons each and mounted just 2 5-inch guns without the sophisticated fire control systems of the larger destroyers. They carried 3 torpedo tubes adequate for anti-submarine work but minimal for surface combat. These tiny ships had been designed primarily for convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare, not surface combat against battleships whose armor belts were thicker than the destroyer escort's entire hulls. At 0637 on the morning of October 25, 1944, Enan William C. Brooks spotted the approaching Japanese force during his routine anti-submarine patrol. The pre-dawn sky showed the dirty yellow gray hue typical of tropical mornings with broken clouds at 1,500 feet and visibility about 20 miles interrupted by occasional rain squalls. Brooks had launched from St. Lo at 0605 as part of the Combat Air Patrol and anti-submarine sweep. His orders were routine: patrol a sector 20 miles north and west of Taffy 3. Watch for submarines and report anything unusual. At 6:37, something very unusual appeared on the northern horizon. Brooks descended to investigate and radioed his initial report: ships bearing 240 degrees estimate for battleships, 7 cruisers, 11 destroyers. Rear Admiral Sprague received the initial report with disbelief bordering on irritation. Some screwy young aviator reporting part of our own forces, he muttered to his staff on Fanshawe Bay's flag bridge. The identification must be mistaken. Those had to be Admiral Holst's battleships from Task Force 34. Everyone knew Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Sprague ordered Brooks to verify his identification. 3 minutes later at 6:40, Brooks confirmed his sighting with words that made Sprague's blood run cold. I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw. There was no mistaking those distinctive Pagid-style superstructures. Those were Japanese battleships, and they were heading directly toward Taffy 3 at high speed. At 0645, lookouts on the escort carriers spotted anti-aircraft bursts on the northwestern horizon as the Japanese ships engaged Brooks' lone Avenger with their anti-aircraft batteries. Moments later, colored splashes began erupting around the carriers as Japanese ships opened fire with ranging shots. The Japanese used different colored dyes in their shells to allow spotters to identify which ship was scoring hits. Red, green, yellow, and blue splashes began walking toward the American carriers. One officer later described it as a deadly rainbow advancing across the water. The brilliant hues created Beautiful but terrifying fountains as shells weighing hundreds of pounds detonated on impact with the sea. At 0646, Yamato fired her first salvo from maximum range. The 9 18.1 inches guns hurled 9 tons of steel and explosive toward the small American carriers. Sprague faced an impossible tactical situation with no good options. His carriers could not outrun the Japanese force, even coaxing 19 knots from engines designed for 18. The carriers would be overtaken within 2 hours at most. His 5 inches guns could not penetrate battleship or cruiser armor. The destroyer's guns could damage cruiser superstructures but not sink them. His aircraft were armed for ground support missions with general-purpose bombs and rockets, not armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes. The torpedo bombers carried Mark 113 aerial torpedoes, but most had already expended them on dawn strikes against shore targets. The nearest American heavy ships capable of challenging Kurita belonged to Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment group 90 miles to the south. Those battleships had just finished annihilating the Japanese southern force in a night battle at Surya Strait and had depleted most of their armor-piercing ammunition. They could not reach Samar for hours, even at maximum speed. Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet was 300 m to the north pursuing Ozawa's carriers. Even if recalled immediately, Hull's battleships needed 6 hours to reach Samar. Sprague had perhaps 15 minutes before Japanese shells found their range and began systematically destroying his carriers. Yet in those minutes, he formulated a response that would become a masterclass in naval tactics against overwhelming odds. First, he ordered all carriers to launch every available aircraft immediately. Pilots scrambled to their planes, still wearing pajamas or shorts. Engines turned over before pre-flight checks were complete, and planes roared off carrier decks armed with whatever ordnance happened to be loaded. Some carried depth charges meant for submarines. Others carried general-purpose bombs for shore bombardment. Some launched with empty wings, their pilots intending to make dry runs to distract Japanese gunners. Second, Sprague turned his formation east-southeast toward a rain squall his radar operator had spotted 5 miles ahead. The weather would partially mask his ships and by precious minutes. Third, he ordered maximum speed from his carriers. Engineering crews pushed boilers beyond their design limits, coaxing every possible revolution from turbines never intended for sustained combat speeds. Fourth, Sprague commanded his escorts to generate smoke. The destroyers and destroyer escorts carried chemical smoke generators that could produce thick artificial fog banks. Combined with black funnel smoke from the carriers' overheated boilers, the smoke would create a dense screen between the carriers and Japanese optical rangefinders. At 6:50, Sprague transmitted an uncoded radio message on all frequencies. Under attack by Japanese cruiser force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers at position 11 degrees 46 minutes north, 126 degrees 20 minutes east, request immediate assistance. The clear text broadcast, violating normal radio security, was received by every American naval unit in the Philippines and triggered immediate panic in multiple headquarters. Admiral Kincaid, still engaged with the remnants of the Southern force, realized with horror that no American heavy ships protected the northern approach. Admiral Halsey, 300 m north of Cape Eno, engaging Ozawa's carriers, received Sprague's call with equal horror, but relief would take hours to arrive. Taffy 3 had only minutes. At 0701, the first Japanese salvos began landing among the carriers. The scale of the incoming fire defied comprehension for men who had spent the war providing close air support and hunting submarines. Yamato's 18.1 in guns fired shells weighing 3,220 lb projectiles heavier than a compact automobile. Heavy cruiser 8 inches guns fired 260 pounds. Shells designed specifically to gut unarmored targets like escort carriers. Battleship Congo's 14 inches guns added their weight to the barrage. Against this onslaught, the carrier's thin steel hulls, a fraction of an inch thick in places, offered no protection whatsoever. A single large caliber hit could gut an escort carrier from stem to stern. Multiple hits would sink one within minutes. Sprague's ships zigzagged frantically using a tactic called chasing splashes. Officers directing the ship's maneuvers watched where shells landed and immediately steered toward those spots, gambling that Japanese gunners would not fire twice at the same location. This desperate improvisation actually worked more often than not. Japanese gunners trained to lead targets moving in straight lines struggled to adjust for American ships constantly changing course toward their previous shell impacts. Shells that should have struck home instead screamed past bow or stern, missing by yards, but some found their marks. White planes took a direct hit that fortunately failed to explode, the armor-piercing shell passing completely through her thin hull and out the other side. Kinnan Bay was straddled repeatedly near misses, sending geysers of water cascading across her flight deck and jamming her rudder temporarily. The rain squall provided temporary reprieve at 0706. For 10 precious minutes, Taffy 3 steamed through torrential rain that reduced visibility to less than 1,000 yards. The Japanese guns fell temporarily silent, unable to see their targets through the deluge. Officers and crew used those minutes to organize damage control parties, prepare abandoned ship stations, and say prayers. Many men believed they would not survive the next hour, but they remained at their stations, determined to sell their lives dearly. As Taffy 3 emerged from the squall at 0716, the tactical situation had worsened dramatically. Kurita's force, faster than the American carriers, had closed the range by several miles during the chase. Colored splashes now erupted all around the carriers with frightening accuracy. Near misses sent shrapnel sleeting across flight decks. Direct hits were inevitable. Sprague made the decision that would define the battle and save his carriers. At 0716, he ordered the destroyers to conduct a torpedo attack against the Japanese force. Without waiting for detailed instructions, Commander Ernest E. Evans of USS Johnston had already charged toward the enemy. At 07106 minutes before receiving Sprague's order, Evans had independently turned Johnston northward and begun his attack run. Evans was Cherokee and Creek Indian from Oklahoma, proud of his heritage and fearless to the point of recklessness in combat. His features reflected his Native American ancestry, earning him the nickname the chief among his crew, though never to his face. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year and 2 days before the Battle of Sama, Evans had addressed his assembled crew with words that became legendary. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single sailor requested transfer. Evans had spent the intervening year training Johnston to an edge so sharp that his crew could execute complex maneuvers by instinct. Gunnery drills were conducted daily. Damage control parties practiced constantly. Every officer and enlisted man cross-trained on multiple stations. Now Evans pointed his ship toward the heart of the Japanese formation and ordered flank speed. Johnston's turbine screamed as she accelerated past 35 knots, racing toward ships that outweighed her 50 to 1. The range when Johnston began her run was approximately 35,000 yards, over 17 nautical miles. Her Mark 15 torpedoes had an effective range of 10,000 yards, just under 6 miles. To launch, Evans would have to penetrate to point-blank range in naval terms, closing through 17 miles of heavy gunfire from dozens of enemy weapons. Johnston's crew laid chemical smoke as she charged, generating a thick, artificial fog that partially obscured her from Japanese optical rangefinders. But smoke could not stop shells. At 0707, Johnston engaged Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano with her 5.5 inches guns at maximum range. The Mark 37 fire control director linked to a Mark 1A computer gave American destroyers a devastating advantage in gunnery accuracy, while Japanese optical rangefinders struggled with smoke, rain, and rapidly changing ranges. Johnston's radar painted perfect firing solutions continuously updated in real time. Johnston's shells began hitting Kumano repeatedly. The American destroyers' 54-pound projectiles could not penetrate the cruiser's armored belt, 4 to 5 in of hardened steel protecting her vitals, but they could devastate her superstructure and upper works, where thinner armor and numerous flammable materials created vulnerabilities. Over the next 10 minutes, Johnston fired over 200 main battery rounds at Kumano, an astonishing rate of fire maintained through superbly trained gun crews working in perfect coordination. At least 45 shells struck the heavy cruiser, starting multiple fires and devastating her bridge and fire control Stations. Kumano's topside became a hell of exploding shells and burning metal. Her communications were severed. Her fire control was disrupted. Though her engines remained functional and her main battery intact, Kumano's ability to fight effectively was severely degraded. At 0720, having close to 10,300 yards, Evans launched Johnston's entire spread of 10 torpedoes. The weapons stray at 46 knots, leaving phosphorescent wakes pointing directly back at their launcher. One torpedo, possibly two, slammed into Kumano's bow. The explosions tore off the entire front section of the cruiser from the bow to the forward turret. Kumano's speed dropped immediately to 8 knots as water flooded her forward compartments through the massive hole where her bow had been. She turned away from the battle, escorted by heavy cruiser Suzuya, detailed to protect the crippled ship, removing 2 major Japanese units from the fight at the critical opening phase of the battle. Johnston had accomplished what seemed impossible. A 2,100-ton destroyer had crippled a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser armed with 10 8-inch guns, each of which individually outweighed Johnston's entire main battery. But victory came at a terrible and immediate price. At 0730, as Johnston turned to hide in her own smoke, Yamato fired a full 9-gun salvo at what her fire control station had identified as an American light cruiser. The Japanese had mistaken Johnston for a much larger ship based on her aggressive attack and the heavy damage she had inflicted on Kumano. From 20,300 yards away, over 9 nautical miles, Yamato's optical rangefinders had acquired Johnston with deadly accuracy. 3 18.1-inch shells struck Johnston almost simultaneously. The first hit below the waterline aft, penetrating the destroyer's unarmored hull as easily as a rifle bullet through paper. The explosion tore into the after engine room, rupturing steam lines and flooding compartments. Scalding steam erupted as 600 degrees pressurized vapor flashed cedar into more steam. Men in the engine room died instantly, either killed by the explosion or boiled alive by escaping steam. The second shell struck amid ships, destroying Johnston's aft engine completely and severing power to the rear half of the ship. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17 knots instantly. The third shell hit 2/3 down the ship, severing electrical power to 3 of her 5.5-inch gun turrets, leaving only the 2 forward mounts operational. Each 18.1-inch projectile carried explosive force beyond comprehension for those who had never experienced battleship fire. The shells weighed 3,220 pounds each and contained 73 pounds of Type 88 explosive. They were designed to penetrate 16 in of armor plate at 20 m before detonating inside enemy battleships. Against Johnston's unarmored hull, they punched completely through the thin steel plating before their delayed action fuses triggered detonation. This over-penetration actually saved Johnston from immediate destruction. Had the shells detonated on impact, they would have blown the destroyer in half. But even over-penetrating, the damage was catastrophic. Johnston's after-third was a twisted wreck of torn metal and flooding compartments. Yamato's secondary battery of 6.1-inch guns fired simultaneously with the main battery. 3 155mm shells slammed into Johnston's superstructure with devastating effect. One shell hit amidship, destroying an anti-aircraft fire director and killing its crew. 2 more struck forward, obliterating the torpedo director and tearing apart the bridge. The bridge became a slaughterhouse of steel splinters and body parts. Commander Evans was blown off his feet by the blast. 2 fingers of his left hand severed by a steel fragment. His uniform shirt literally torn off his body by the concussion. His chest and face were peppered with small steel fragments. Much of his bridge crew was killed instantly. The navigator, Lieutenant Ed DeGardi, lost part of his left hand to shrapnel. The helmsman was wounded but maintained his station, keeping the ship under control through instinct and training. The quartermaster was killed at his post. Blood covered every surface on what remained of the bridge, with power lost to 3 main gun turrets, steering control severed, engines crippled, and half his bridge crew dead or wounded. Johnston should have been finished. Standard naval doctrine dictated that a destroyer suffering such damage should retreat immediately or face certain destruction. But Evans was not a standard officer, and Johnston's crew was not a standard crew. Damage control parties worked with Desperate efficiency, learned through endless training drills. Within 10 minutes, they had restored electrical power to the two forward gun turrets through emergency cables. They had re-established steering control to the emergency station on the fantail. Evans, despite severe wounds and significant blood loss, refused medical treatment beyond minimal field dressing to stop the bleeding. All medical supplies for wounded crew, he ordered the ship's doctor. Save the medicine for men who need it more than I do. Evans relocated his command from the shattered bridge to the fantail, where manual steering was now being conducted. He shouted steering orders through an open hatch to sailors manually turning the rudder by hand, cranking the heavy mechanism that normally operated through hydraulic power. Johnston was still in the fight, reduced to 17 knots with 3 of 5 guns out of action. With half her crew dead or wounded, she remained combat effective through the sheer determination of her crew and the leadership of a captain who refused to quit. Over the next 2 hours, Johnston would continue fighting, engaging target after target until Japanese shells finally sent her to the bottom. At this critical moment, USS Hull and USS Herman began their own torpedo runs, followed shortly by the 4 destroyer escorts. The converging attacks created chaos in the Japanese formation. Kurita's ships had been steaming in a cruising formation optimized for speed and mutual support, not for maneuvering combat. The aggressive American attacks forced them to maneuver independently to avoid torpedoes, breaking up their coordinated fire plans and creating confusion in command and control. Japanese commanders had expected to steamroll the American carriers through overwhelming firepower. Instead, they found themselves dodging torpedoes, maneuvering to avoid collisions, and losing track of both enemy positions and their own ships. Locations in the smoke and rain. USS Hull, commanded by Commander Leon S. Kintberger, charged directly toward the Japanese battleships in the center of their formation. At 0743, she launched a half-salvo of 5 torpedoes at Battleship Congo from 9,000 yard. The battleship turned hard to starboard to avoid the spreads, combing the torpedoes by presenting her narrow bow and allowing the weapons to pass harmlessly down her length. But the maneuver forced Congo to cease firing temporarily and took her out of position in the formation. At 0754, Hull fired her remaining 5 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Haguro from under 6,000 yards, terrifyingly close in naval combat terms. At least 1 torpedo struck Haguro in her engineering spaces, causing flooding and forcing the cruiser to reduce speed for damage control. But Hell paid a terrible price for her audacity. Japanese shells began hammering the destroyer as she made her approach. Over the next 45 minutes, Hell absorbed over 40 major caliber hits from battleship and cruiser guns. Her bridge was destroyed by an 8-inch shell that killed most of the officers stationed there. Her forward engine room flooded from hits below the waterline. Her number 2 gun mount was blown off its foundation. All steering control was lost, forcing the ship to beacon from the emergency steering station aft. All power was lost when her remaining engine room flooded at 0830 with his ship dead in the water, listing heavily and sinking. Commander Kintberger ordered abandon ship. Hell rolled over onto her port side and sank stern first at 0855. Of her crew of 273 officers and men, only 86 survived. 187 died, either killed by shell hits, drowned when the ship sank, or taken by sharks during the 2 days survivors spent in the water awaiting rescue. USS Herman, commanded by Commander Amos T. Howe, executed perhaps the most daring single maneuver of the entire battle. At 0754, she launched her full spread of torpedoes at Battleship Haruna from 4,400 yards, less than 2.5 m. The torpedoes missed as Haruna turned hard to avoid, but the battleship was forced to turn away from the carriers, taking her temporarily out of effective gun range. Moments later, Man found herself trapped between 2 columns of Japanese heavy cruisers closing from different directions. With suicidal courage and remarkable ship handling skill, Hathaway steered Herman directly between Battleship Congo and heavy cruiser Chikuma, crossing both ships' bows at point-blank range in a textbook cross of the T maneuver executed in reverse. The Japanese ships faced with an American destroyer suddenly appearing directly between them at ranges of less than 5,000 yards were forced to turn hard to avoid collision. In doing so, they masked each other's gunfire and lost track of Herman in the confusion. Man escaped the trap with damage from several near misses, but no direct hits. Having forced two major Japanese units to break off their pursuit of the carriers, her aggressive attack and brilliant seamanship had disrupted the Japanese formation at a critical moment. Throughout the battle, Hermann continued engaging targets of opportunity, her 5-inch guns scoring hits on multiple cruisers, though causing relatively little damage against their armored hulls. The 4 destroyer escorts, designed for anti-submarine warfare and never intended for surface combat against heavy ships, followed the destroyers into battle after initial hesitation. At 0742, Rear Admiral Sprague ordered the Little Wolves the radio call sign for destroyer escorts to attack. The initial order was somewhat ambiguous, and the destroyer escort commanders were unsure whether they were supposed to join the destroyer's coordinated attack or conduct a separate attack. After several minutes of confusion, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland of USS Samuel B. Roberts decided to act independently rather than wait for clarification. He ordered his ship to follow the destroyers into battle. Samuel B. Roberts was the smallest of the small boys, displacing only 1,350 tons, fully loaded, about the size of a World War I destroyer. Copeland had pushed his ship beyond her design limits to keep pace with the larger destroyers, dangerously overpressuring her boilers to 660 pounds per square inch, well beyond the design limit of 440 pounds. The engineering crew maintained this pressure for over an hour, gambling that the boilers would not explode, coaxing 28.7 knots from a ship designed for maximum speed of 24 knots. Black smoke poured from Roberts's stack as her boilers strained beyond their design capacity. Before ordering his ship into battle, Copeland addressed his crew over the ship's public address system with words that would become legendary in Navy law. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The words were matter of fact, not dramatic. Copeland simply stated the tactical reality every man aboard already understood. They were charging toward heavy cruisers in a ship designed to fight submarines. Their chances of survival were minimal, but their duty was clear. The carriers had to be protected regardless of cost. At 0810, Samuel B. Roberts launched her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Chokai from approximately 4,000 yards, close enough that her 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns could engage Chokai's superstructure directly. Sailors manning the smaller weapons raid the cruiser's upper works with automatic fire, shattering windows and killing exposed personnel. 1 torpedo struck Chokai's stern engineering spaces, causing catastrophic damage to her propulsion system. Combined with a 500 pounds bomb hit from a Taffy 2 aircraft that detonated in her engine room minutes later, Chokai was left dead in the water with uncontrollable flooding. Destroyer Fujin Army later scuttled the crippled cruiser with torpedoes. Roberts had achieved what her designers never imagined possible. A destroyer escort had mission killed a heavy cruiser armed with 88 8-inch guns. Roberts then engaged heavy cruiser Chikuma in an extended gun duel at ranges fluctuating between 5,000 and 7,000 yards. Her 2 5-inch guns fired 608 rounds in 35 minutes, a sustained rate of fire of over 17 rounds per minute per gun. Astonishing for manually loaded weapons. The gun crews worked with machine-like precision, loading, firing, and loading again in a rhythm that never slowed despite Japanese shells exploding all around them. The aft gun mount, designated Mount 52, was commanded by Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, a 24-year-old from Chakakota, Oklahoma. Carr's gun crew maintained their incredible rate of fire even after losing electrical power to the mount, manually cranking the turret into position and hand-loading each 54-pound shell into the breech. At approximately 0850, a Japanese 8-inch shell struck Mount 52, penetrating the thin gun shield and exploding inside the mount. The blast killed or wounded most of the crew instantly, but the gun itself remained functional and Carr, though horribly wounded, refused to abandon his post. His gun continued firing. At 0851, disaster struck. A powder charge cooked off in the overheated breech, detonating prematurely as it was being loaded. The explosion destroyed the gun mount completely, shattering the barrel and blowing the breech mechanism apart. Carr was caught directly in the blast, suffering catastrophic wounds described by witnesses as ripping him open from neck to groin. When rescue parties reached Mount 52 after the abandoned ship order, they found Carr dying at his station, still holding the mount's final shell, begging with his last breaths for someone to load it so the gun could keep firing. He died moments later. Carr was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his actions. USS Carr FFG 52. An Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate commissioned in 1985, was named in his honor. At 0851, an 8-inch shell from Chuma penetrated Samuel B. Roberts below the waterline, exploding in the forward engine room. The blast was catastrophic. The engine room was a confined space packed with high-press steam lines, fuel lines, and machinery. The explosion ruptured everything simultaneously. Steam at 600 degrees scalded men to death instantly. Fuel oil ignited, creating an inferno. Water flooded in through the hole blown in the hull. The engine room became a death trap. Most personnel stationed there died within seconds. The ship's main engines and generators were destroyed. Samuel B. Roberts lost all power and began flooding rapidly. At 0909, a second shell struck near the aft 5 inches mount, killing more men. At 910, with his ship dead in the water, flooding uncontrollably and sinking, Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordered, "Abandon ship." Samuel B. Roberts capsized and sank at approximately 10:05. Of her crew of 224 officers and men, 89 were killed in action. An additional 25 died from wounds, exposure, or shark attacks during the 2-day survivors spent in the water. 120 men ultimately survived, many bearing wounds and psychological scars they would carry for life. The destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond conducted their own attacks, firing their limited torpedo loads at Japanese cruisers. While they scored no confirmed hits, their aggressive actions contributed materially to the chaos disrupting the Japanese formation. They also laid massive amounts of smoke, creating fog banks that degraded Japanese optical fire control and provided intermittent concealment for the carriers. Small boys had accomplished their mission. Through sacrifice and audacity, they had disrupted the Japanese attack, bought time for the carriers, and sunk or damaged multiple enemy ships. But the cost was terrible, and their ordeal was far from over. Throughout these surface actions, American aircraft swarmed over the Japanese ships in continuous attacks that historians would later describe as some of the most courageous flying of the Pacific War. Taffy 3's pilots faced an impossible situation. Their aircraft carried ordnance meant for ground targets, not naval armor. Many Avengers had already expended their torpedoes on pre-dawn strikes against Japanese positions ashore. The Wildcat fighters carried machine guns effective against aircraft, but useless against battleship armor. Some pilots attacked with depth charges, cylindrical weapons designed to explode underwater near submarines. Against surface ships, depth charges were nearly worthless, but pilots dropped them anyway, hoping to cause some damage or at least distract Japanese gunners. Yet the pilots pressed home attack after attack with courage bordering on insanity. Young ensigns and lieutenants, many with fewer than 200 hours of total flight time, dove on the most powerful battleships ever built. They made run after run, attacking from different angles, some flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire so thick it seemed impossible to penetrate. When their bombs and torpedoes were gone, they made dry runs, diving at Japanese ships without weapons, forcing enemy commanders to maneuver and spoiling their gunnery. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders proved profound. Vice Admiral Kurita, watching wave after wave of American aircraft attacking his ships, became convinced he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The ferocity and persistence of the air attacks seemed impossible from the small jeep carriers he had been briefed about. The coordination between different squadrons suggested a much larger force. Pilots from Taffy 2 joined the battle as word spread. Rear Admiral Felix Stump, commanding Taffy, immediately ordered his squadrons rearmed with heavier weapons. Avengers were loaded with Mark 13 torpedoes and 500-pound general-purpose bombs, the heaviest ordnance available. Within 30 minutes of Sprague's initial distress call, Taffy 2 launched strike after strike. Throughout the 90-minute surface battle, Taffy 2 launched 3 full strikes totaling over 70 sorties against Kurita's force. These attacks proved devastating. The concentrated air strikes sank 3 Japanese heavy cruisers and damaged others, disrupting Japanese command and control throughout the battle. At approximately 0820, aircraft from Taffy 2 hit heavy cruiser Suzuwa with a near miss that detonated her starboard forward torpedo tubes, the Type 93 Longin's torpedoes, each carrying 1,080 pounds of high explosive, detonated in a chain reaction. The explosions blew massive holes in Suzuya's hull and started uncontrollable fires. The cruisers' damage control parties fought desperately to contain the fires and flooding, but the damage was too severe. Around noon, with fires raging out of control and ammunition beginning to cook off, Suzuya was abandoned. She sank at approximately 13:20. Heavy cruiser Chikuma, already damaged by Samuel B. Roberts's gunfire, was hit by multiple torpedoes from Taffy 2 aircraft. The torpedoes opened her hull to the sea. Chikuma began sinking slowly, her crew abandoning ship as she settled lower in the water. Destroyer Noki took aboard survivors before heading north to rejoin the fleet. Chikuma sank that afternoon. Heavy cruiser Chokai, dead in the water from Roberts' torpedo when the bomb hit to her engine room, was scuttled by Japanese destroyers with torpedo hits rather than leave her for American salvage. The escort carriers themselves became direct targets as Japanese ships closed range despite the smokescreens and maneuvering. USS Gambia Bay, positioned on the port flank of the carrier formation, fell behind the other carriers as the chase continued. Her engines, stressed beyond their design limits, could not maintain the pace. Captain Walter V.R. Vuig, known as Bowser for his pugnacious personality, watched helplessly as the distance between his ship and the others gradually increased. By 0800, Gambia Bay had become isolated. A stragglers separated from the protection of the formation. At 0807, Japanese heavy cruisers Chikuma, Tone, and Haguro concentrated their fire on the struggling carrier from ranges of approximately 15,000 yards. Their 8 inches shells began finding the range. At 0810, Chikuma's shells hit Gambia Bay's after-flight deck, starting fires. More hits followed in rapid succession. At 0820, a shell penetrated below the waterline near the forward engine room, causing catastrophic flooding. The explosion opened the bulkhead between compartments, and seawater rushed in. The forward engine room flooded completely, killing most of the personnel stationed there. Gambia Bay lost the use of one engine. Her speed dropped from 18 knots to 11 knots. She fell further behind, now isolated and defenseless. Johnston, despite her crippled condition, attempted to draw fire away from Gambia Bay. Commander Evans, still commanding from the fantail, ordered his 2 remaining operational guns to engage the Japanese cruisers, hammering the carrier. Johnston's shells struck Chikuma and Tone, causing minor damage, but forcing both cruisers to temporarily shift fire. But 3 cruisers firing from close range could not be deterred for long. The cruisers' shells continued to hammer Gambia Bay. Multiple hits struck her engine spaces, her hangar deck, her hull. Fires raged through the riddled carrier. At 0840, Gambia Bay was dead in the water, listing heavily to port with fires visible throughout her structure. At 0850, Captain Vuig ordered abandoned ship. The crew began going over the sides into the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. At 0907, Gambia Bay capsized to port. Her keel appeared above the surface, and survivors in the water could clearly see shell holes in her underwater hull. The port propeller was missing, blown off by one of the hits. She remained floating inverted for only 4 minutes. At 9:11, USS Gambia Bay sank, disappearing beneath the surface in less than a minute. From first hit to final sinking, only 61 minutes had elapsed. She was the only American fleet or light carrier sunk by surface gunfire during World War II. Of her crew of approximately 800, 147 were killed immediately by shell hits or drowned when the ship sank. Many more would die in the water over the following 2 days. Nearly 700 men went into the water as Gambia Bay sank. They would spend 50 hours floating in shark-infested seas before rescue craft found them. The other carriers suffered heavy damage but remained afloat through desperate maneuvering, smokescreens, and the sacrificial attacks of their escorts. USS Kinnan Bay was hit 15 times by shells, ranging from 5 in to 14 inches caliber. One 14 inches armor-piercing shell from Battleship Congo passed completely through the carrier from port to starboard without exploding. The delayed action fuse failing to trigger. The massive projectile left holes 4 feet in diameter in both sides of the ship, but caused surprisingly little damage between entry and exit points. Had it exploded, Kinnan Bay would have been destroyed instantly. Other hits killed and wounded crew members, started fires and caused flooding, but damage control parties contained the damage. Kinnan Bay survived. USS White Plains sustained multiple near misses and at least one direct hit, but her crew kept her engines running and her steering functional. USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague's flagship, dodged over 100 near misses through radical maneuvering personally directed by Sprague from the flag bridge. The Admiral's calm voice over the radio, directing his task unit with steady commands, despite shells exploding around his ship, helped maintain morale throughout Taffy 3. The carrier's single 5 inches stern guns engaged Japanese cruisers whenever targets came within their 18,000-yard maximum range. The little guns scored hits on several cruisers, causing minor damage to superstructures, but nothing approaching critical damage against armored warships. Nevertheless, the return fire forced Japanese ships to maneuver, contributing marginally to the general disruption of their attack. At approximately 0845, crippled and surrounded by Japanese destroyers, USS Johnston made her final heroic charge. Commander Evans had observed Japanese light cruiser Yahagi and destroyers Isakaze, Yukaze, Urikaze, and Noki forming up for a coordinated torpedo attack on the carriers. Despite having only one operational gun turret, one barely functional engine producing perhaps 10 knots, and steering controlled by men manually cranking the rudder, Evans turned Johnston toward the 5 enemy ships. It was suicide, and every man aboard knew it, but the carriers had to be protected. Johnston's remaining forward gun fired as fast as the crew could load, scoring hits on Yahagi with several shells. But Japanese destroyers quickly surrounded Johnston, pounding her with gunfire from point-blank range. Shells from 5 inches guns ripped into the already battered destroyer from multiple directions. At 9:10, with all guns silenced, both engines destroyed, fires raging throughout the ship and the hull listing heavily from uncontrollable flooding, Commander Evans ordered abandon ship. Men began going over the sides, jumping into the warm water and swimming away from the sinking destroyer as fast as they could. At 10:10, USS Johnston rolled over onto her port side and sank rapidly. As she went down, sailors on Japanese destroyer Yuki Kazi came on deck and stood at attention, saluting the sinking American destroyer in recognition of her crew's extraordinary courage. The gesture, captured in multiple Japanese accounts, reflected the respect Johnston's fight had earned even from her enemies. Commander Ernest E. Evans was seen abandoning ship floating in a life jacket, but he was never recovered. Of Johnston's crew of 327 officers and men, only 141 survived. 186 died, either killed in action, drowned when the ship sank, or taken by sharks during the long wait for rescue. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest decoration for valor. The citation read in part, "for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Johnston, in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the Battle of Sama." The first to lay a smokescreen and to open fire as an enemy task force rapidly approached, Commander Evans gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection, launching the first torpedo attack when the Johnston came under straddling Japanese shellfire. At 9:25, after nearly 2.5 hours of continuous combat, something miraculous occurred. The Japanese attack faltered. Vice Admiral Kurita, his command and control disrupted by aggressive American destroyer attacks, continuous airstrikes, and confusion about what forces he actually faced, ordered his scattered ships to reform and regroup. Communications between Japanese ships had broken down during the chaotic running battle. Individual captains had been making independent decisions, chasing whatever target appeared closest. Rather than following a coordinated plan, Kurita feared he was facing the main American carrier force, with heavy battleships nearby ready to trap his force. At 9:25, he ordered a general retirement to the north to consolidate his scattered fleet. What Kurita did not realize was that he had been on the verge of complete and total victory. The American destroyers were sunk or sinking. The destroyer escorts were out of torpedoes, low on ammunition, and critically damaged. The carriers were nearly out of fuel and ammunition. Gambia Bay was sinking. The others were damaged and slowing. Another 30 minutes of sustained attack would have destroyed Taffy 3 completely and left Lady Gulf's invasion beaches utterly defenseless against Japanese battleship fire. Instead, Kurita withdrew. The decision remains controversial among historians 8 decades later. Some argue Kurita lost his nerve after nearly drowning when a Targetgo was torpedoed. Others suggest he was simply too cautious, unable to accept casualties in pursuit of a decisive victory. Still others contend his decision was reasonable given the information available to him at the time. From the American perspective, the withdrawal seemed impossible to believe. Aboard USS Fanshawe Bay, a signalman standing near Admiral Sprague called out words that captured the surreal moment. "God damn it, boys. They're getting away." Officers and crew members stared in disbelief as the massive Japanese battleships and cruisers turned northward and began steaming away from the carriers they had been on the verge of destroying. Sprague himself was incredulous. He had been absolutely certain his entire force would be annihilated. His after-action report filed days later reflected his amazement at the outcome. The success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Sprague wrote, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz would later echo this sentiment in his official assessment of the battle, adding his own observation that Taffy 3's survival defied all rational tactical analysis. But there was no time for relief or celebration. At 10:50, even as Taffy 3 recovered from the surface action and rescued survivors from the water, a new threat appeared. 5 Japanese aircraft approached at low altitude from the west, climbed to approximately 2,500 feet, then dove directly toward the carriers. These were not conventional attacks. The pilots had no intention of pulling out of their dives. They were aiming their entire aircraft at American ships. The Divine Wind, the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps, was making its first organized appearance of the war. One Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighter, crashed into USS Kitkan Bay's portside near the waterline. Its bomb exploded on impact, blowing a hole in the carrier's hull and causing flooding, but the damage was not fatal. Kitkan Bay's crew controlled the flooding and kept the ship operational. Another kamikaze targeted USS White Plains, but was destroyed by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft exploded in midair and crashed into the sea short of its target, showering the carrier with debris, but causing no significant damage. USS St. Lo was not as fortunate. At 10:53, a Zero fighter piloted by Lieutenant Yukioki dove through heavy anti-aircraft fire and crashed through St. Lo's wooden flight deck near the center line. The aircraft's 250 kilograms bomb detonated inside the hangar deck, igniting aviation gasoline and armed ordnance waiting to be loaded on aircraft. Secondary explosions tore through the ship as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the intense heat. Within minutes, flames consumed St. Lo from stem to stern. The fires spread faster than damage control parties could contain them. At 11:25, with fires raging out of control and major explosions occurring every few minutes, Captain Francis McKenna ordered abandon ship, St. Lo exploded in a massive fireball at 11:25 and sank within minutes. The first major American warship sunk by a kamikaze attack. The psychological impact of the kamikazes would haunt American sailors for the remainder of the war. But in October 1944, the tactic was new and its full implications not yet understood. Taffy 3 had survived both the surface attack and the kamikaze strike, but the cost was staggering. 4 ships sunk in combat: USS Johnston, USS Hull, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and USS Gambia Bay. The escort carrier USS St. Louis sunk by kamikaze. Multiple other ships damaged, some severely. American casualties totaled 1,161 killed and missing, plus 913 wounded. The survivors who abandoned ship spent up to 50 hours floating in the tropical waters of the Philippine Sea before rescue ships found them. Many men died from wounds, exposure, dehydration, or shark attack while awaiting rescue. The waters of Samar were known to be heavily populated with sharks, attracted by the warm water and abundant food sources. Survivors reported seeing sharks constantly during their time in the water. Some men simply disappeared, pulled under by predators. Others died from wounds that would have been survivable with immediate medical care, but proved fatal after hours in the water. But Taffy 3 had accomplished its mission completely. The invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf remained secure. General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 troops continued landing unopposed by naval gunfire. The Japanese center force, despite its overwhelming superiority and firepower, had been turned back without reaching its objective. Kurita's force continued north after breaking off the attack, hovering in the waters off Samar for several hours while attempting to regroup and assess damage. He changed course multiple times from due north to west to southwest and back to north again. At approximately 1310, it became apparent to American observers that Kurita was heading away from Leyte Gulf permanently. He transited back through San Bernardino Strait that night, returning westward toward Brunei. American aircraft from Admiral Halsey's fast carriers pursued and attacked the retreating Japanese force throughout the afternoon and evening of October 25. Light cruiser Noshiro was sunk by air attack. Destroyer Hiroshima was damaged and had to be beached on the coast of Samar, where she was later destroyed. Destroyer Noki, carrying survivors from heavy cruiser Chikuma, ran into American cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Miami, and USS Biloxi during the night transit through San Bernardino Strait. The American cruisers crippled Noki with gunfire and destroyer USS Owen finished her with torpedoes. Noki sank with all hands, including the Chikuma survivors, over 1,200 men total. The Battle of Leyte Gulf as a whole was the largest naval battle in history, measured by tonnage of ships engaged, geography covered, and strategic consequences. Over 200,000 personnel participated across an action area of approximately 100,000 square miles of ocean. The Japanese Navy deployed nearly every operational warship remaining in its fleet. The Americans deployed major elements of both the 3rd and 7th Fleets. The conflict actually consisted of 4 distinct major engagements fought over 4 days across 500 miles of ocean. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea on October 24 saw American carrier aircraft sink the battleship Musashi. The Battle of Surigao Strait on the night of October 24 to 25 saw American battleships annihilate the Japanese Southern Force in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. The Battle of Cape Engano on October 25 saw Admiral Halsey's carriers sink all 4 of Ozawa's carriers, and the Battle off Samar on the morning of October 25 witnessed Taffy 3's desperate stand against the center force. The Japanese Navy lost 26 warships totaling 306,000 tons of displacement. 3 battleships were sunk, Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea and Yamashiro and Fuso at Surigao Strait. 4 carriers were lost, Zuikaku, Zuo, Chitos, and Chiyoda at Cape Engano. 10 cruisers were destroyed, including 3 at Samar. 9 destroyers were lost. Over 10,500 Japanese sailors perished during the 4-day battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again operate as a major fleet. Fuel shortages, damage to surviving ships, and the loss of trained personnel reduced it to a defensive force incapable of offensive operations. The Americans lost 6 ships totaling 37,000 tons. Light carrier USS Princeton was sunk by a Japanese air attack on October 24. 2 escort carriers, USS Gambia Bay and USS St. Louis, were lost at Samar. 2 destroyers, USS Johnston and USS Hull, were sunk at Samar, and one destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, went down there as well. American casualties totaled 2,831 killed and 913 wounded across all engagements. The strategic victory was complete and decisive. The Japanese Navy had gambled everything on Operation Shogo and lost catastrophically. The Battle off Samar, the central action of Leyte Gulf, stands apart in naval history for its sheer improbability. Never before or since has such a mismatch in forces resulted in such an outcome. The numbers were impossible to overcome through conventional analysis. For battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers against 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The tonnage ratio was roughly 10-1, favoring the Japanese. The gun power ratio was even more lopsided. Yamato's main battery alone could deliver more shell weight in a single salvo than all of Taffy 3's guns combined could fire in 5 minutes. Yet the smaller force not only survived but forced the larger fleet to retreat without completing its mission. How did this seemingly impossible outcome occur? Tactical analysis reveals multiple contributing factors, each essential, though none sufficient alone to explain the result. First, aggressive American destroyer attacks disrupted Japanese formation integrity at a critical moment. Kurita's ships had been steaming in a formation optimized for fuel efficiency and mutual support during approach, not for combat. The sudden need to maneuver independently to avoid torpedoes scattered the formation. Ships moved without coordination, each captain making autonomous decisions, creating chaos that degraded Japanese fire concentration. Ships obscured each other's line of fire. Communications broke down as radio circuits overloaded with conflicting reports and orders. Individual Japanese commanders lost track of both American positions and their own fleet's disposition. Smokescreens laid by American destroyers and escorts compounded the confusion, reducing visibility drastically and impairing Japanese optical fire control systems that required clear sightlines. Second, American radar-directed gunnery proved far superior to Japanese optical fire control systems under the prevailing conditions. The Mark 37 fire control director linked to a Mark 1A computer allowed American destroyers to generate accurate firing solutions continuously despite smoke, rain, rapidly changing ranges, and violent maneuvering. Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts scored repeated hits from ranges in conditions where Japanese return fire struggled to find accuracy. This technological edge partially offset the American disadvantage in gun caliber and ship size. Japanese fire control relied primarily on optical rangefinders, sophisticated instruments that performed well under ideal conditions but faltered when visibility decreased. Smoke and rain squalls off Samar gave American radar a decisive advantage. Third, American damage control outperformed Japanese practices, keeping ships fighting longer despite critical damage. Johnston fought effectively for over 2 hours after losing half her propulsion, 3 of 5 gun mounts, and suffering flooding in multiple compartments. Kinnan Bay survived 15 shell hits, including a 14-inch projectile passing entirely through her. Crew training emphasizing damage control, combined with good compartmentalization in ship design, paid decisive dividends. Japanese damage control was less effective, partly due to design philosophies emphasizing offensive firepower over survivability and partly due to less rigorous damage control training. When American destroyers struck Japanese cruisers, the damage often proved more severe than comparable hits to American vessels. Fourth, Japanese armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate battleship armor over-penetrated the thin hulls of American destroyers and escort carriers, reducing their destructive impact. These projectiles had delayed action fuses that detonated after passing through several inches of steel. Against battleship armor belts 8 to 16 inches thick, they functioned perfectly. Against destroyer hulls only a fraction of an inch thick, the shells often passed through entirely before detonating, lessening interior damage. Had the Japanese used high-explosive shells with instantaneous fuses against unarmored targets, the damage would have been catastrophic. The fact that many shells over-penetrated was fortunate for the Americans. Fifth, American air attacks maintained constant pressure, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver continuously and diverting attention from surface targets. Even after bombs and torpedoes were expended, pilots conducted dry runs to compel ships to turn, disrupting gunnery solutions. The psychological pressure of continuous air attack, combined with Kurita's concern about facing more powerful forces, contributed significantly to his decision to withdraw. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was heavy but not overwhelmingly effective. American pilots pressed attacks with determination despite casualties. The fundamental factor behind Taffy 3's survival and success was human courage and tactical audacity, executed with such ferocity that it convinced the enemy they faced a far larger force. Commander Ernest Evans charged toward Yamato without orders, understanding instinctively that aggression was the only chance for survival. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland took Samuel B. Roberts into battle against heavy cruisers, knowing survival was unlikely but attack necessary. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered destroyers to conduct suicide torpedo runs, delaying the Japanese advance to protect the carriers. These decisions came from desperation, yet they were executed with total commitment and ferocity, convincing Kurita he faced fleet carriers and heavy units rather than escort carriers and destroyers. The Japanese, trained in Mahanian doctrine emphasizing decisive fleet engagements, expected opponents to maneuver cautiously and preserve strength. Weaker forces were supposed to retreat, not attack suicidally. American destroyers violated every assumption, attacking aggressively, closing to point-blank range, and fighting until their ships sank beneath them. This behavior was incomprehensible within the Japanese tactical framework, causing confusion and contributing materially to Kurita's belief that he faced a much larger force. The aftermath recognized Taffy III's extraordinary valor. The entire unit received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors the United States can award. The citation praised extraordinary heroism against powerful Japanese fleet units, noting specifically that 2 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort charged battleships point-blank, expending their last torpedoes in defense. Commander Ernest Evans posthumously received the Medal of Honor, recognized as the first Native American in U.S. Navy history to receive it. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland earned the Navy Cross for leading Samuel B. Roberts. Commander Leon S. Kintberger of Hull and Commander Amos T. Hawley of Heermann received the Navy Cross for aggressive actions, along with dozens of silver and bronze stars awarded to other officers and crew. The battle occurred partly due to major communication breakdowns between Halsey and Kincaid. Neither commander wanted to expose failures at the highest levels. The human cost was staggering. Of Johnston's crew of 327, 186 died. Of Hull's 273, 187 died. Of Samuel B. Roberts' 224, 89 died in action with 25 more from wounds or exposure. Of Gambier Bay's crew of 800, 147 died immediately with more succumbing later. Total Taffy III casualties exceeded 1,100 out of roughly 3,500 personnel. Survivors faced horrific conditions in the water, clinging to wreckage and rafts for up to 50 hours under the tropical sun, battling dehydration, wounds, and sharks. Psychological trauma persisted for decades in many survivors. Survival rates were higher than expected due to excellent training in abandoned ship procedures and adequate life-saving equipment. American ships carried sufficient life rafts and flotation devices, and crews practiced survival drills regularly. When orders came to abandon ship, men executed them efficiently, even amidst fires, flooding, and combat damage. The wrecks remained lost for decades. The Philippine Trench, site of the battle, reaches over 20,000 feet deep. In March 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo located USS Johnston at 21,180 feet using the deep submersible limiting factor. The wreck rests on a slope, broken into sections but largely intact, with her bridge showing damage from 6.1-inch shells that killed Commander Evans and much of his crew, and the stern bearing catastrophic damage from Yamato's 18.1-inch shells. This confirmed Johnston as the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed by a manned submersible for 15 months. In June 2022, Vescovo's team found USS Samuel B. Roberts at 22,621 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered, broken into 2 sections, with the forward section upright and the aft section on its side about 10 meters away. The break caused by the 8-inch shell that sank her. Both wrecks are protected under the Sunken Military Craft Act as war graves, their extreme and remote locations ensuring they remain undisturbed. The battle off Samar should never be forgotten. It represents the highest traditions of naval service and courage under fire. Tiny destroyers charging battleships head-on wrote a chapter in naval history, demonstrating what determination, sacrifice, and refusal to surrender can achieve even when defeat seems inevitable. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz described Taffy III's success as near-divine intervention. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, official U.S. Navy historian of World War II, praised the action as unmatched in gallantry, guts, and grit across the Navy's entire history.